Hello everyone, this is the second part of my curves video series where I'm going to talk about the main reason that I use Photoshop, which is to combine curves with masks to create local adjustments. So I will be explaining layer masking a bit in this video. I'm not going to go into the really advanced layer masking, but I am going to explain what they are and how they can be used, and specifically how they can be combined with the curves tool to make local adjustments to your images so that you can really fine-tune all the different areas of your photos in very specific ways. So I'm going to be talking you through a couple of photos. I'm going to show you how I actually use these edits myself, and I'm also going to talk about how the localized use of curves allows you to effectively replace the dodge and burn tools, because really the curves tool is the only way that I manipulate tones in my images in Photoshop. It's that powerful, particularly when combined with curves. And I think once you've got on top of the concept, it's actually not that difficult to understand and apply yourself. So let's get started. So this is the image we're going to edit. It's a photograph from the Nueni in the Drakensberg, one of the most beautiful places I've ever visited, and we certainly had the weather to do this location justice on this particular afternoon, with this thunderstorm drifting through in the background, and the trailing edge of the rain there was just catching the sun's rays, creating this fascinating pattern, and of course the rather lovely rainbow. We also have this fainter feature of these converging anti-crepuscular rays. So really quite a dramatic scene. And of course, there's quite a lot that I'd like to do to this from an editing perspective. A lot being a lot of changes, but not necessarily dramatic changes. I tend to make subtle changes and gradually build them up. Just before we get into the edit, there's two things that I'll say. The first is that if you haven't watched that first curves video, then this video could be a bit like running before you can walk, unless you already have a good command of what the curves tool actually does. The second is that this image is actually edited a little less than I normally would in Lightroom, so it's a bit flatter, and that's really so that you can see the changes that I'm making a little bit more clearly, because quite often the stuff that I do in Photoshop is very subtle indeed, so not really that great for showing you all on this video, but the actual thought process and application of the tools is very, very much the same. So there's a lot of this that you actually could do in Lightroom, but you have that much more control in Photoshop that I much prefer it as a tool. So let's get on and apply some global adjustments first. I'm going to create a new curves adjustment layer here, and I'm going to start by setting black points and white points. So holding down the Alt key and dragging the black slider to the right there until clipping starts to appear in that bottom right hand corner. And actually it makes sense that the clipping would start to appear here, because this is the closest area to the camera, so there's no haze effectively brightening those shadows. And then we do the same with the white point, holding down Alt and dragging to the left until these red dots start to appear, and we can see a little clump appearing just here. So that's telling us that the red channel only is clipping and that there's detail in the other color channels. So we're going to allow that tiny bit of clipping to happen, and you can see that that's made a really nice change there to the contrast of the image. But I do want to add just a little bit more contrast to make the tones a little bit deeper and richer. So I'm going to create a new curves adjustment layer. You could use that previous one, but I tend to just stack them one on top of another. And I'm just going to drag the shadows down a little bit and then push the midtones back up to where they were. So I don't really want to change the highlights and midtones too much, but you can see that adds a nice bit of contrast as well. And that's as far as we're going to go with our global changes. So that's the before and that's the after. Now, of course, this video is all about the local changes, and to talk about local changes using the curves tool, we first need to understand layer masks. So I'm going to create a slightly superficial example here so that we're not discussing both curves and layer masks at the same time. I'm going to create a new layer here, and I'm going to fill it with a color. So we click fill and then color. And yeah, actually this kind of dull blue is going to be absolutely fine. I just don't want anything that's in my face too much. So there we have a solid blue layer over the top of our image, and we can turn the visibility of that layer on and off to reveal the image below and all of those adjustments that we just applied. But if we turn it back on, what we're going to do is make sure it's selected, and we're going to create a new layer mask by selecting the new layer mask button icon here, so this rectangle with the circle in the middle of it in the layers palette, and we click that and you see this white rectangle appear next to our image layer, our blue layer. And you can actually see that rectangle already exists for these curves adjustment layers. So actually the layer mask gets automatically created when you create an adjustment layer, and you can select them by just clicking on them. Of course, we want to edit this layer mask for the blue layer, so I'll select that one. And I've also got the gradient tool selected here, and I've got black and white already loaded as my foreground and background colors. In fact, I'm going to press the X key to invert those, and I'm just going to drag a gradient from top to bottom in the image here, so you can see it's a fairly soft gradient. And now we can see half of the image and half of it is obscured by blue. So what's going on here? Well, we can look at the layer mask and you can actually see that this layer mask has now changed. It's black at the bottom and white at the top. But if we want to see it in more detail, we can alt click on it, and that brings up the layer mask. So the key thing to know here is that white will show the layer and black will hide the layer. And then any tone in between is effectively a varying level of opacity. So if it's very close to black, then say it's 90% opacity, mid-gray would be 50% opacity, light gray might be 20% opacity, or whatever it is. So it's a gradual transition from the effect being applied in full at the top to not being applied at all in this bottom portion of the image, and that's defined by that gradient. So we can just see that image again. Now you can constantly click on this layer mask, select it again, and then paint those tones wherever you want just with the normal paint tool. So if I select the paintbrush tool, in fact, let's select the pencil tool first to keep it really simple. So I'm going to create a massive pencil brush here. So the pencil is just a hard-edged brush effectively, but it makes it really clear what we're doing. So I'm going to paint a white circle in here, and if we click on the layer mask, we can see that white circle, and sure enough, we're applying 100% of this layer in the area where we've just painted white. Now if I press the 5 key, that changes the opacity to 50% at the top here, and that will allow us to paint white on at a 50% opacity. So if I click here, then you can see it becomes half blue. So again, clicking on that layer mask, it's 50% applied. And actually I can click over the top there. So here is sort of 75%, and then we've got 50 either side. And if we click off the mask, you can see that it's applied sort of 75% blue in that area in the middle. So I can select the brush tool here, and let's have a nice soft edged brush. I'm just using the bracket keys and holding down shift incidentally to change the softness, and I'm going to press 0 to change it back to 100% opacity, and I can paint around here and paint in that blue layer, or I can press the X key to switch to black, and I can paint away bits that I'd already painted in, thereby revealing what was there before. And of course I can change the opacity again. I can press the number key and go back in and change the color back to white so that I'm painting the effect back in here. So I'm now just painting 50% anywhere that the brush goes with a nice soft edge. And then I can paint it away by switching back to black and changing the opacity to 0, and so on and so forth. And if you get to learn these shortcuts in particular, the softness shortcut, the size shortcut, and then change the opacity using the number keys, and X, and then change between white and black, you can actually get in and get really used to painting in and away this adjustment, in this case just this blue layer. But it does mean that I can relatively quickly, for example, paint in the edge of the mountain blue, albeit with a soft edge. But if I wanted to get in and paint a local area very, very specifically, then I can zoom in and I can set a harder brush, and I can come in and very closely follow that edge. I mean, of course, you can really go as close as you like and be as precise as you like. And at this point, it might well be better to use things like luminosity masks and advanced selections. But just to show you that you can be very, very specific with exactly how you paint the masks here. And if I click on the mask itself with that alt click again, then you can see exactly what I've painted in here. Of course, it is a complete mess and nothing like what we actually want to do in reality, but hopefully that's given you a good idea of exactly what the mask does. So I've just deleted it, so it's now black, so that adjustment isn't being applied at all. And just to recap, you can drag a gradient over the top. So this is a 100% gradient. We could actually drag a 50% gradient over the top if we wanted to. And you can use the blend modes of the gradients. That can be useful as well for you to experiment with. And of course you can use the paintbrush, but the paintbrush you have far more control than you do in Lightroom, because you can zoom in and out so easily, and you can change the size and softness of the brush very easily and paint much more precisely than you can in Lightroom. So the actual masking ability, even with the brush tool, is better than it is in Lightroom. But if you combine it with advanced selections, which I'm not going to show, then you can really make quite complex masks. So that's how masks work. I'm not going to rabbit on any more about that, but needless to say, especially when you get good with the shortcuts, you can create masks very easily. But even before that, it's relatively easy to create them. So let's delete that layer, and this time we're going to go into something a bit more practical. So I think it makes the most sense when I'm making these local adjustments to start with the larger areas first. And the first area I'm going to change is this area of dark cloud. Now it is nice and dark and moody, so we don't really want to change the tone of it too much, but it would be nice if I could bring out a bit more of the structure in the cloud here. Some people might use the clarity slider or something like that to do that sort of thing, but I far prefer to do it with contrast. I think it makes a much nicer result. So I'm going to use the curves tool to do that. And I'm going to start by just figuring out where exactly these tones are on the curve, so we can see the area of the curve there, where that circle is appearing. That's where we want to make the curve steeper to add contrast. So I'm going to push up the curve to the right of that area and push it down to the left of it. And let's just tweak those a little bit. And if we turn that on and off, you can see we're adding a fair amount of contrast into the cloud. In fact, let's just add a little bit more than that still. So you can go in and change that as you want. So there's before and after. That looks good, but of course we're far over contrasting the rest of the scene. That's where our mask comes in. So we select our layer mask. We've got our gradient tool selected here. I'm going to make sure that white is my foreground color, so pressing the X key. And then I'm going to hold down Shift as I drag down from the top to make a nice soft-edged but also straight line gradient adjustment. So that adjustment is now only applied to the cloud at the top there. So let's have a look at the layer mask. It's 100% applied at the top. It's 0% applied below there where it's black, and of course the gradient between. And there's a couple of things that I'd like to fix about this. The first is if I turn that adjustment on and off, you can see that it effectively introduces a lot of blue. In fact, what's happening is it's just saturating the blue that was already there, but I think that's pretty undesirable. It competes with the other colors in the image. So I'm going to change the blend mode here to luminosity so that it only affects the tones in the image. So there's the before. And there's the after. You can see we've completely eliminated that blue problem. The other thing I don't like is this top right-hand corner in particular just looks too contrasty now. So the tones here are too dark and the highlights in the cloud are probably too bright, and it actually creates a distraction of its own. So I don't want this effect to be applied as much as it is to this top right-hand corner. So I'm going to paint that away using the paintbrush tool. If I press X, then I can have black selected. Let's go in with a 50% opacity, so the 5 key, and enlarging the brushes with the bracket keys. And then I just paint away that adjustment. And I'm just looking at what it actually looks like. And actually, I probably don't want any of that adjustment at all in this top right-hand corner. So I've effectively painted black into this entire area. So if I alt-click on the mask, we can maybe just fine-tune it a little bit more. But it's pretty imprecise and pretty soft-edged, which is why you can't see that it's imprecise. Maybe the transition just there is a bit too strong, so I'll just soften it slightly. And this is looking pretty good. Maybe take away a little bit just there. And are those highlights getting too bright? Let's just make sure that that change isn't being applied in that local area. So that's having a look at the mask again. So I'm pretty happy now with that adjustment. I think we've added the contrast where we wanted to, so you can see those structures just being brought out that little bit more, but we're not adding contrast in this top right hand corner, and I think we're done with that adjustment. So the next area I'm going to look at is this bottom right hand corner, and I'm going to try to brighten some of the shadow detail whilst keeping the darkest tones dark. So I'm going to create a new curves adjustment layer, and this time I'm actually going to create the masks first. I'm going to do that for a specific reason so that I can show you something. So the first thing is I've actually dragged this mask the wrong way around. If you do that, Control I will invert it, but you could always just switch your colors around and redraw it if you want to. So we've now selected effectively this bottom right hand corner, and actually a mask really is just a selection that you can edit. And I did it this way around because you can see that the histogram updates to just show that localized area. So actually we can tell that the tones inside the mask are in this section of the histogram because that's where the massive peak is. So this is where we want to make the shadows brighter. So if we just push this section up, but what I don't want to do is make the very darkest tones too bright. So I'm just going to make sure that that the very darkest tones don't change. So actually we've kind of created a localized S-curve in our darkest tones. That's one way of visualizing it, but we've added a lot of steepness to that curve in this local area, and that's why we've managed to bring out all of that contrast. Now in this case where we've added color with the contrast, it actually does us some favors. I think that probably looks better if anything, so I'm going to leave that aspect of it. But maybe it's a little bit too strong, so I'm just going to turn the opacity of that layer down just because it's quicker than changing the shape of the curve. And then finally, if I turn this on and off, you can see we're actually affecting this area outside of the pinnacles, which we don't really want to. So again, I'm going to paint away with the brush tool, and let's just do 100% opacity. So I press the 0 key to do that. And I'm just going to paint away this area around the pinnacles because I don't want to brighten that area or add saturation. And I think that's done a pretty good job there. Let's just get rid of that change. And actually let's tone it down even more. So actually I'm only applying this adjustment to a 50% opacity now, but you can see it just lifts that shadow detail, which will make all the difference when I'm making a nice print. So there's a couple more areas I'm going to work on. There's these crepuscular rays. So let's see if we can bring those out a little bit more, the anti-crepuscular rays actually. So I select a new curves adjustment layer, and you can see how I end up stacking these curves adjustment layers one on top of another as I spot different areas of the image to work on. So this time we're going to use this finger tool, and we're going to push up the bright area of the ray there, and we're going to push down this darker area so you can see all that contrast is added. But once again we have a blue introduction into those shadow areas, so it becomes far too blue. Let's invert this mask so the change isn't applied at all. And then this time I'm going to paint in white in the area where I want that to be affected. So I'm going to press the X key so that we have a white paint there, and we're going to paint in with 50% opacity, so the 5 key, and let's just gradually build this up. It might be that we end up painting it to 100%, but we can just start with 50 and do it fairly subtly. So I think in that entire area actually is pretty good. That's looking about right, but we possibly have added too much blue because of that contrast adjustment. So of course, let's try our luminosity blend mode. But when we do, you can see that it becomes really quite grey because we've added a lot of contrast, but we haven't added any color at all. And in this case, it just looks bad. So either way, whether we choose normal mode or luminosity mode, normal is too saturated, luminosity is too desaturated. So what I tend to do in these circumstances is I will effectively just split the difference. So I change the opacity of this layer to 50%, and then I duplicate it. So the shortcut for that is Control and J, and that duplicates the layer, and this one we're going to set to luminosity mode. So that now effectively doesn't really affect the color. If we turn those two adjustments on, then you can see the color doesn't really shift at all. We're neither desaturating or appearing to desaturate, nor are we saturating. So I think that's done a pretty nice job. Now, I don't know if you can see this on your screen, but we might have a bit of banding appearing, and actually no, that's just Photoshop poorly approximating its own mask. But if you were to see any banding in this area, one tip for you, should you see any banding, and you can do with these kinds of masks, is actually to do something called dithering. So this is going to be way over the heads of some people, but effectively what you do is you just add noise. So you go filter and then noise, add noise, and we just add a tiny amount of low level noise, say 1% or something. Or let's do 2 for the sake of it. Now this noise is never going to appear in your image. You're not adding noise because the adjustment is very subtle. But what that will do is effectively dither the stepping between these different layers of grey. And I realise as I'm saying this that I'm probably going to turn a load of you off talking about that too much. So that is a way of solving that problem should you come across it, but this image doesn't suffer from that. If you do need to copy the mask across rather than repeating that effect, I can hold down Alt and drag the mask over the other and it just replaces it. We just click yes there, and that makes sure that both masks are completely identical should that be useful to you. And it might be if you create a really pixel perfect mask or a luminosity mask or so on. So that's another tip there. Now, last area we're going to target is the rainbow and pattern in the rain here, the way that the sun is shining through those bands of rain. So let's create a new curves adjustment layer. And this time we're going to add some contrast to a brighter tone in the image. So you can see this lies a little higher up the curve, but we want to slightly brighten that area and slightly darken that area. So that's the usefulness of using that finger tool there. It can be a little bit quicker. Again, I'm going to invert the mask so that it's black, and then I'm going to paint in that effect looking as I go. So again, let's select 50% brush, white, and gradually add in that contrast. So that looks like it's doing a really nice job. And in fact, I don't want to overdo it, so I'm probably not going to do any more than that. And let's just see how it affects that rainbow. Well, actually, I don't like what it's doing to the rainbow because you can see it gets a little bit darker maybe. So let's create another curves adjustment. And this time we're just going to have a play around and see what the rainbow looks like if we just create a curve of our own here. Let's try a brightening one. There we go. And then if I invert that and then paint in white. So this time we're bringing in that contrast, but we're actually brightening the rainbow up a little bit. And let's just tweak that a little bit more. So we probably didn't want to make it darker, but we do want to make it a little bit steeper. There we go. So that's the before and that's the after. And actually maybe we've destroyed some of the subtlety of the rainbow there. So let's take that right back to 40%. So we're literally just helping it along, just the tiniest tweak there. And that's my process. So that's the way that I go around an image, gradually improving subtle areas of the scene. And I can do this very rapidly because I'm using a single tool. I'm using a single process, effectively just adjusting that curve and then adding a layer mask. And I'm very fast at painting the layer masks because I've become accustomed to it and I've learned the shortcuts. But crucially, the thought process is there. I look at the image and I'm focusing on what needs doing to the image. I'm not thinking about the tools and how it can be achieved because I've become competent with those tools. So the last bit of this video, I'm going to bring up a new image and we're going to talk about dodging and burning, because dodging and burning is something that all photographers love to talk about. And I find it a little bit confusing that so many people use fairly sort of brute force approaches using the dodge and burn tools. So we're going to look at those and we're going to look at a better way of doing it using curves. Dodging and burning is a process that is pretty much as old as photography itself, and there's nothing particularly magical about it. It's basically just brightening and darkening different areas of the image. So there is a slight mystique associated with dodging and burning, and there's loads of videos on YouTube telling you how to do it, but there really is nothing more to it than that. It is just local brightening and darkening, and I'm going to show you that. So I've got the dodge tool selected here, and if we did want to use this this tool, which hopefully you won't want to after this, you would just duplicate this background layer here so that you weren't actually damaging the original photo, so that you could at least go back and start again if you needed to. And we're going to try brightening different areas of this image. So my idea here is to try and match the brightness of the cloud on the left there with dodge adjustments of this cloud on the right and at the bottom, because it's looking a bit thin. So we're just trying to bring out that cloud texture a little bit more. And let's brighten down here in the valley as well, make it look like there's a bit of sunlight getting down there, brighten up this wisp of cloud. And I think that's doing a nice job. So now we're going to switch to burning. So we're going to try and create a vignette around the image to focus all the attention on the central portion, on the river flowing through there. So I'm going to darken this top left hand corner, and let's just darken down the cloud on the top right a bit more too. And then I think we've done a pretty nice job there. So let's turn that off and on, and you can see how we're just redirecting the viewer's attention. And this actually is not the kind of edit that I would make myself, although one thing I might do is darken down this cloud to match the rest. But it certainly is the kind of change many people would like to make and do make. So I'm just showing you how that is done with the dodge and burn tools. But of course, what the interest will be in here is whether I can actually replicate this using curves. So what I've done here is I've created a copy of the background layer, and I've just applied the dodge effect to the entire image. So I've just painted over the entire thing using the dodge tool at about 20%, I think it was. And then I've tried to recreate it using the curves tool. So that's what's going on in this group of layers here. So if I turn the visibility on there, what I actually have is the background layer, so the untouched original, and then a curves adjustment to try and simulate that dodge layer. So if I turn off the combination of those layers, this is the dodged layer that you're seeing now, and this is the background layer with my curves adjustment. And if you saw those change, well done. There is the slightest difference, but you can see they're essentially identical. Similarly for the burned layer, so that with this layer I just burned the entire scene and then tried to recreate it using curves, and that's what this group is here. So if I turn this group on and off, you can see I didn't quite do it perfectly, but that's mostly because I couldn't be bothered to go back and forth trying to perfectly tweak the curve in this case. But I'm sure you'll agree that they are very similar indeed. So if we now look at the shape of these curves, well, that's the burn curve. So what's happening here? We're darkening the midtones and we're darkening the highlights a little bit, but we're not doing really anything to the darkest shadows. And with the dodge curve, well, we're brightening the midtones and we're brightening the highlights, but we're not doing anything to the very darkest tones again. So that's what the dodge and burn tools actually do in terms of a curve. And it's pretty unsurprising that we can replicate them, because I think we already established that the curves tool here gives you full tonal control of the image, and those are just tonal adjustments. So the question is, why would you bother trying to perfectly replicate the dodge and burn tools using curves and going back and forth and trying to perfectly match it so that you could recreate this curve? Well, of course, the answer is you never would. So let's just drag this dodge tool out of the layer group here so that I can just treat it separately. And I'm going to hide this layer group. So now all we have is that background layer. In fact, let's just delete these and drag them into the bin there. And we've now just got the dodge layer and our background layer. So this is the layer that we thought perfectly replicated that dodge tool. Now, the reason that I would much prefer to do this with an adjustment layer is that I can actually change the type of adjustment. So for example, I might want to open up the shadows a little bit more with this layer. So I might want to move this point around, and maybe I didn't like the highlights getting quite so bright. So I can just slightly flatten off this section and make sure that the brightness is actually coming into the midtones a bit more. And so I can be quite specific with the tonal adjustment that I'm making. And of course, as I showed you earlier, you can use the painting tools in exactly the same way as you would the dodge and burn. So if I want to create that same effect again, I can just select my brush tool here, and let's select a 20% opacity, and I've got white selected, and we just come in here. In fact, let's set it to 50% just to be faster, and we can come in here and we can do exactly the same process. So our idea was to brighten this cloud, and you can come in here and paint over the cloud, and you can paint in your sunlight just the same way as you did with that dodge tool. And similarly, if we want to add that vignette, we can create a new curves adjustment layer, and we're just going to drag it down because, to be honest, that's close enough. But if you did want to protect those shadows, then you could. And we're going to invert that layer mask, Control I to make it black, and then we're going to paint in our darkening adjustment this time with a massive soft edged brush into that top corner there. And maybe we want to actually make this darker. So again, this is the beauty of having an adjustable change there, so we can go back and make that adjustment whatever we want it to be. And we can also take advantage of the blend modes. If we didn't like the change of color there, then we can keep it to luminosity so that we don't get that warmth coming in. And that's how you would replicate the dodge and burn tools using the curves tool. And I have seen so many different methods for dodging and burning now. The most popular one maybe is to create a new fill layer. So I'm going to fill this with mid-gray and then set the blend mode to overlay. And then people will paint in, let's just turn off those adjustments that I just made. People will then just paint in with white or black at a very low opacity. So black would be to do your burning, as you see there. So that's me painting in black, and white would be the dodging. So if I press the X key, which for some reason isn't working, but let's just set that to white and turn the brush size down, then we can paint it. And obviously this is being a little bit harsh, so you could turn down the opacity of that layer, for example. But that's another popular method for dodging and burning. It's another method that you don't need to learn if you understand how curves work, because curves are the most powerful tool in Photoshop. There is almost no limit to what you can achieve with them tonally. And in the final video, I'm going to talk about how you can use them to make useful color changes to your images. So I really hope you've enjoyed this video. Please do subscribe and keep an eye open for that third part, which should be coming sometime next week.